Mags, Kate, welcome to the Vet Vault. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
One of you has to say hello.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's try that again.
You want to start again?
Yes.
I'm Gerardo Polo.
I'm Hubert Hemstra, and this is the Vet Vault. Hello, Vet Vaulters, and welcome back to another episode, which is kind of a follow-up to a previous episode. I've got two questions that we want to try and answer in this episode. What are we so afraid of? What's the worst that can happen? In episode 49, we dissected one of the biggest fears that many vets have, the fear of an official board complaint, from the perspective of a practitioner facing a complaint against them with Dr. David Tabrett. In this episode, we look at the same issue from the side of the official body who deals with the formal complaints. I'm a firm believer that the more we know about the things we fear, the less scary they become. So, let's face this one together. Now, we appreciate that the exact rules and interpretation of rules will vary depending on where you are and who your regulating body is. But I'd imagine that the sentiments and principles would be much the same and that you could safely extrapolate the general gist of this conversation to your own circumstances. By all means, if you're on a board or a council or another regulating body somewhere else, or you know somebody who is, and you feel that there's something to add to this conversation, then please get in touch and correct us. Drs. Clarke and Magdoline Awad are vets with experience serving on vet boards. They join us to answer all of our questions about board complaints. Like, how common are they? What the most common complaints are? What the process looks like if you do have one lodged against you, as well as practical tips for avoiding them in the first place. Kate and Mags also walk us through all the possible outcomes. In other words, how much trouble would you actually be in if worst comes to worst? Basically, what's the worst that can happen? But then, what is much more likely to happen? Now, about our guests. Kate has over 20 years experience as a GP vet in regional Australia and the UK, and holds a membership of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists in Small Animal Medicine and has a master's degree in Business Administration. In addition to her role on Victoria's Vet Board, she's also the founding director of Engaged Solutions, a veterinary HR consultancy, and serves on the Australasian Veterinary Board's Council's Sustainable Practice Committee. Kate is an Australian Vet Association graduate mentor and a policy council advisor for the AVA's Veterinary Business Group, tasked with developing the AVA Great Workplaces policy. I'm exhausted just reading that, never mind doing any of it. But we're not done. Kate is also leading the development of a brand new not-for-profit called Sustainable Veterinary Careers, or SVC, which has a revolutionary approach to helping members of the vet profession achieve exactly what it says in the title, have a sustainable career. I'll tell you a bit more about that after the podcast, so stick around or check out the links in the show description and have your voice heard by completing a very important survey for SVC. Somewhere in between all of that, Kate also has a veterinarian husband and 2 teenage kids. Mags is Chief Veterinary Officer at Green Cross. She did her memberships in animal welfare and has a degree in veterinary professional practice management. She was appointed to the Veterinary Practitioners Board of New South Wales in 2019, and now I'm going to list some of her other leadership roles. Member of the University of New South Wales Animal Care and Ethics Committee, New South Wales representatives for the AVA Welfare and Ethics Special Interest Group. Previously a member of the Animal Research and Review Panel of New South Wales, as well as part of the DVM Selection Committee for the University of Sydney. Mags was Chief Veterinarian at the RSPCA New South Wales from 2008 to 2015 after starting with the organisation in 1996. She's been involved in the development and management of community programs in remote regional areas of New South Wales, working with local veterinarians and government to improve the welfare of pets in those communities. She's also spent 4 years as the Chief Veterinary Officer for PetSure, where her mission was to increase pet insurance awareness and penetration in Australia. What a pair of slackers. I'm going to put on my CV that once I managed to schedule a 2-hour podcast recording with these two, plus the famously elusive Gerardo Polo. Please enjoy Kate Clarke and Mags Awad. Mags, Kate, welcome to the Vet Vault. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us, guys. We're looking forward to talking about it.
Now, I'm going to...
I know, wait. I'm here too, okay? Yes. Just in case listeners out there thought that I wasn't here, but I'm here.
Yeah, nobody cares. So I want to start with why we're doing this episode with you guys in your roles as board members. Well, all of us, Kate, I know you and me definitely have a shared interest in that. We care a lot about what's happening in the profession and how can we make it better. But Mags, I'm sure in your role, that would be a big issue for you as well. How do we create a sustainable career or a happy place for vets to work in? And I know Gerardo feels the same. So I'd spend a lot of time thinking and reading up and trying to find out what the problem is. Why are so many vets unhappy with their careers? And I know it's multifactorial, there's lots of reasons for it, but I have a theory that I've been thinking about more and more. And it's, I think one of the reasons is we become vets because we want to help, yeah, right? We love animals and we love people, or some of us love people, some people don't. But most of us have a desire to help, and we go into this career from a place of caring and love, I suppose. But then by the time we hit the floor, by the time we roll out there, there's so many things that we worry about and things that can go wrong that it sometimes shifts to a fear-based way of practicing. And I think when you come from that point of view, rather than saying, I'm doing this because I love it, the things that I do, I'm doing because I'm scared of consequences, it changes it. I think that definitely detracts from potential enjoyment. So, I don't know, do you think the theory is valid potentially? Any of you?
Yeah, I think the theory is valid for sure. I certainly have experienced that kind of mindset myself at times. And you're right, I think it's certainly something that actually detracts from your enjoyment, but also detracts from your growth as a vet, which obviously then feeds into your enjoyment and motivation to do things.
So then the next part of my thinking is about looking at where that fear comes from. Like, what are the things that we're afraid of, and are those fears justified? And I know from personal experience and from chatting to many vets over the years that one of the primary fears is that fear of getting into trouble with a board or with your local council or whoever your regulating body is where you work. And then the other thing that I'm learning about fear is that fear usually comes from ignorance, doesn't it? It's people are scared of stuff they don't understand, and that the better we get to know the thing that we fear so much, the less afraid we become of it. So I would love to know more about our boards, so that hopefully we'll realize that most of our fears about the boards are unfounded. So let's start with what exactly the board is. What exactly is the role of the vet board? For example, are you guys there to represent or to protect vets, or what exactly is it? Where do you fit in?
I guess the board's mission is obviously under the Act, is there to protect the public and the health and welfare of animals by regulating vets. And that might sound controlling and punitive, but it's not actually the mindset that's actually behind what we do. So protecting animals and the public's about reducing risk to them. So while that might mean deterring behaviours or restricting how people practices, it's more often than not, it's about providing clear guidance about the capabilities and professional standards that are expected, and providing objective and peer and public feedback and direction for further development if it's needed. So I think there's awareness at board level that is something that vets experience, is that fear. But I think there's also consciousness of trying to move away from that.
So pets are you did say pets, yes?
I said animals.
Okay, cool.
All
Okay, great.
animals.
Okay, cool. Okay, so at the center of everything is the animal, which as a veterinarian, then, like when you said that, it ticked something in my head, which was, this is not about me potentially. It's not about the owner, because at the center of it, between me and the owner, is the pet. And if the assessment and the objective of the vet surgeon board is to ensure the health and welfare of pets or animals has been taken care of, then it makes me it somehow takes a personal attack, the personal whatever it is, away from it. That's how I just personally felt just then.
Yeah, I mean, the board's there to make sure that the legislation is actually enforced, and part of the legislation is the welfare of animals, but also to ensure that the consumers of the services that we provide are actually well informed about the competencies of the vets, and that there is an acceptable standard of care that's provided from a public interest perspective. And we're not just talking about small animals and stuff, because you also got vets in food safety, you've got vets in trade, all those sorts of things. And really there's also that public health protection. So whilst the animals are important in terms of their welfare and the outcomes, it really is about making sure that we provide those services as best we can. It's about mitigating risk to the public as well. So for me, there's always been that issue as a veterinarian. Who are we looking after? We're almost like pediatricians. We're looking after the patient, but we've actually got a client or an owner, and in the case of a pediatrician, a parent or a guardian. So it's a really difficult thing because we've got to meet the expectations of the owner or the parent, but our main advocacy is for that welfare of that pet. And that's, come out in our code that the welfare of the patient comes first.
So the role of the board, because a lot of complaints that I hear about the board is people say, well, we pay these fees towards the boards, but they're not doing anything to protect us. Is protection of veterinarians a role of the board, or should we just get over that idea and say, well, is it there to protect the profession or the individual, or what's the hierarchy? Is it first the pet, the owner, the vet? How does it work?
I think what we've just talked about in terms of putting the animal's welfare and right at the centre of it is probably crucial, and that kind of recognises and reflects that we're all, rather than having a sort of an us and them mindset, we're all on the same team, whether we're public or vets, to achieve that animal welfare. So that's the first thing. Certainly, as Mag said, the public need that assurance that there's a standard, and I think that can be certainly viewed as positive for vets. Obviously, we have an ability to stand and say we're vets and we're respected for what we do, and it does add to the trust that people have in us as individuals on a daily basis, but also as a profession. It's important to recognise that while the fees from vets go to the board to do their work, that work is actually, all of that comes under a piece of legislation. That's not something that we can just change. I thought when I joined the board, I could just go, we could just make this a bit more current, up to speed. It takes decades to do that. Okay. I was quite naive there. Doesn't mean we're not trying. But on that big picture thing, really, we talk about all of us to serve and protect the animals and the public. We actually have to look after the profession and the individuals in it. So I think there's really strong recognition of that. So where our role as boards, both at a state and a national level, is looking at making sure we've got enough vets with the right skills, a clear understanding of what's required of them, and accountability for what they do, and sufficient health or the provisions to manage any sort of ill health to ensure the professional standards can be maintained. So while we're not there to advocate for the profession, we are key to helping us all do what we signed up to do as vets, which is look after animal health and wellbeing.
Yeah, and that's right. And then specifically in New South Wales, the board sort of functions, they really have a few functions, obviously registering veterinary practitioners, and we actually also license veterinary hospitals. And part of that licensing process is also making sure there are minimum standards. And there's actually an inspection process as well. So that allows the hospital inspector to visit the clinics to actually give advice, all the things that are important to maintaining high standards, but also ensuring that they comply with the Act and the code. So things like, making sure there's good record keeping, not just with, S8s and other things like from a health perspective, but also ensuring that your consent forms, that there is actually a process for informed consent, all those sorts of things are in place. So that part of it is also a really important part. And of course, the most important part in terms of investigating complaints, that's one of the biggest roles of the board, and in some cases taking disciplinary action against veterinarians if a complaint is found to stand. I guess the board's composition is really important, and a lot of the legislation is state-based, and so therefore we can't just have a blanket way of doing things across each state. So every state is different. I can talk on behalf of the New South Wales board in terms of how it operates, but there are actually veterinarians on the board representing vets in rural areas, urban vets, specialist vet, vets working in academia, and 2 veterinarians that are selected by the minister. And of course, we have our consumer representatives. So we've got 2 of those. So the board actually does have quite a varied composition. And I think where there is a need to seek legal advice, the board will do that. But for the most, it is made up of veterinarians representing different parts of the profession, and they're your peers. So from that perspective, I think that gives a lot of reassurance to vets that the people that are on the board are actually their peers, and they're making decisions based on their experiences and their knowledge, which is very similar to the experience and knowledge of the people that we're investigating the complaints against.
Absolutely. And ours is quite similar in Victoria. We've got 6 registered vets out of the 9 people on the board, 1 lawyer and 2 more community members as well. So we've also got that range of perspectives for both the skills that we're bringing to the board and the governance side of things, but also the impartiality. And when we're looking at complaints, we're not looking at gold standard, although obviously we encourage, best practice where you can, but what the actual measurement for us under the Act is whether a behaviour meets the expectations of the vet's peers and the public. What I didn't know before I joined was that the majority of fees go to the staff who are doing the majority of the day-to-day work, and we've got a real cross-functional team there with IT and financial communications, registration team, a general manager, registrar. And in the complaints and investigations team, we've actually now got a mix of lawyers and a vet to make sure both the proper processes are followed, but also the appropriate technical information is gathered. So that's where the fees are all going, to making sure that the profession is well regulated, but also that support, and there's a really accessible point for both vets and public to access information about vet services.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I just want to share my experience with the board, at least in Queensland. And it was like a lynch mob. No, just kidding. No.
Okay. We're pretty scary, clearly. Look at us, we're terrifying.
What I was expecting was this kind of lynch mob experience. Like the
Spanish Inquisition.
It's the Spanish Inquisition. I'm standing in front, 9 judges. And I remember when I first got this email from the Vet Surgeons Board saying they requested a copy of the records, my recollection of the experience. I was just like, holy shit, that's it. I'm done. My career as a veterinarian's gone. And I've completely effed up. And, I'm sick of this. I'm done with this. And I really felt as if, I went through phases of, I've done the best that I can. And here I am right now getting dragged across the hot coals because of this thing. And then I went there, and I remember writing this massive submission, and it was like, this is the stuff that I've done. This is the education I've done. It was 2 pages of continued professional development and what I contributed to the veterinary profession and all sorts of things. And because I was so defensive by the whole experience. And I went there, and they just had a chat, and they talked about, hey, tell us what happened. What was the experience? Hey, this is what they said. And what I felt was a very fair and objective experience. And I went to the facts. What could I have done better? And I was found guilty. And I was found guilty of terrible history writing. But ultimately, my experience from that walking out after is much different. And I'm actually in the process of being taken to the board again right now. And it's a much different experience. It's one of, hey, look, they're investigating. I'll give them information. We'll have a chat and we'll talk about it. And if I've done something wrong, then I will change. I can adjust. We'll adjust the processes, adjust the protocols, but it's for the better.
Yeah. And look, I think any kind of complaint, whether it's a board complaint, and as you know, Gerardo, being the director of your hospital as well, and in my role as well, there are complaints that don't go to the board. And those complaints, and I guess the majority of them don't go to the board. But when they do come to you, it's like, well, what happened? Let's work out the facts. Let's talk to the people involved. Let's look at the medical notes. It's a very similar process that you would do in-house, right? But I guess the thing is, it's just a thought of being deregistered. Those thoughts go in your mind, and I can understand that because as veterinarians, our careers, it's all very linked to who we are as people. So we feel that there is a failure on us. And I completely understand how people feel. And I guess with our board, our deputy registrar is actually a trained counsellor, and she takes those calls from the complainants before the complaints come in, and she will talk to them about, well, have you gone back to your vet? Have you had a discussion? Because sometimes it's actually one of those things where the client just wants to be heard. And so they ring the board, they have a conversation, and the board is, well, have you spoken to the vet? And some of the times they actually haven't. And they'll go back to the vet. And if I can just say one thing to vets who get a client, come to them and ask them to go through the case with them and make them understand what happened, and listen to people, be open and honest, don't be defensive, because people genuinely, they just want reassurance that they are good pet owners, and they want you as their vet to tell them that they are. And part of that is having those open conversations and really honest conversations with them. And sometimes that's enough to make the complaint not happen. And obviously there's going to be complaints that can, go on regardless of that conversation. But that's really your opportunity as a vet to actually try and make things good with the client, listening to them. And if there are changes that you're going to make, tell them about those changes. We might change this process. But one thing I will say about complaints, unfortunately, they're an individual vet complaint. So the complaint goes against you, Gerardo. But a lot of the times the complaints in the majority of are around processes and the people and the systems that are in place. And so from my perspective, we actually have a quality management working group which looks at all these things within our organisation to try and refine all these processes, because it isn't about a single person. It's about a system that hasn't been supportive of the people in the environment that they're in. So I think as an individual vet, to receive those complaints when you may not have the ability to change other things within the practice.
I think it's great that you mentioned there that not all complaints come to the veterinarian, but also the fact that you said there that have you spoken to them? But it's also like my experience, and I'm not going to name names and organizations and things, but we had advice from a particularly like a very defensive position where it's like, don't speak to them. But then in the end, what we did is that we ended up canning that support and then talking to our indemnity professional insurance company and going like, hey, can we actually talk to our clients? Are we allowed to listen and stuff? So now our process within the company is calling clients, listening, and like 95% of the issues they have, it's all about being heard, and then acknowledging, hey, look, that is amazing. Thank you so much for listening. And so thank you so much for sharing that with me, because what I can do now is I can go back to the team and go, hey, look, this was the client's experience. It was potentially as a result of, as you said, Mags, a process that we have that isn't quite working. So how can we adjust and change? And then like the vast majority of complaints that I tackle, ones which can be adjusted by listening and then going, hey, look, thank you for sharing that, because we can go back and we can change things.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what all of this process is about. The whole complaints thing is just an opportunity for feedback. So whether that's at vet client level or whether it then does go, and I guess as Meg said, and obviously we're speaking from not even on behalf of our boards, but just as people who have board experience in different states. Ours is very similar. We certainly not only phone after we've had that process of the complainant ringing in, and as Meg said, in the last 3 years, less than half of our phone complaints have actually progressed on to a formal complaint. Having said that, the actual phone complaints themselves have more than doubled over the last 3 years. So wow. A lot of work coming into the board at that level, and they're doing a fantastic job of providing the three things that at least starting that process, because as Megs and you've said, Gerardo, people need three things. Their first is to be heard. Their second is to understand what happened, because obviously it's really challenging to get your head around something if you just don't understand why it's happened. And the third is to make a difference. The most common thing that we hear at the end of any complaint is, we don't want this to happen to other animals. It's really not about blame and shame and punishment. That's not what people want. They want to make sure that they can make something constructive out of what's been a really hard thing for them. So our staff are really approachable and fair and impartial in that they're listening to people's concerns. The other thing that they do is do a little bit of triage, because some things that people want to talk about aren't actually in the Vet Act's jurisdiction. So things like fees have nothing to do with us. And there's also other things like drug storage. We get a lot of queries about drug storage and disposal and prescription. That actually all falls under, in Victoria, the medicines and poisons area, not the Vet Act. So all of that stuff happens, and all of this happens before it actually gets to the point of a written complaint being lodged. And then once that's lodged, even all of those don't end up going through to the point where you get your phone call from the vet board to the vet. There's a lot of work that goes on before then. About a third of the actual written lodged complaints don't actually get progressed past the very first board meeting.
Okay.
And that's
so there is a sort of a filter. So there's not some obligation that the board has that. Let's say somebody complains about me. It's a completely silly complaint or a very obvious thing that I haven't done anything wrong. They call you guys. Would there be somebody there who looks at it and go, yes, we hear you, but I'm not gonna stress Hubert out by phoning him and saying, look, there's been a complaint, or do you always? Yeah.
There's it's all set out under the Act. We have to follow that, but there absolutely is a process. Basically, anything that is lodged as a written complaint has to be viewed in Victoria by the whole board. Mm-hmm. So there is no such thing as, we'll just get rid of that one.
Okay.
Everything is seen by the board, and we're only basing decisions at that stage on the information that we've got at hand, which obviously is really variable. The more the better, because sometimes we have to progress things just to get the clinical records to understand what actually happened. Mm-hmm. But at that stage, the whole board makes a decision on whether a complaint is lacking in substance. So that might be, for example, that the owner wasn't happy with the outcome, but there's actually nothing related to professional standards in there. If the complaint's vexatious, so that's if it's born solely from that anger, retribution kind of place, or if the issue doesn't fall under the board's jurisdiction. So as I said, that's about a third of complaints that get lodged fall in that bracket in the last few years. And so the other 2/3 are then delegated on to what's called preliminary investigation. So that's when the phone call happens. That's when the actual information gathering starts. And I guess it's important to understand that is just a preliminary investigation. As Gerardo said, it's quite easy to think and understandable that you think, oh my God, it's an investigation and there's going to be a finding of all bad at the end of this. It really is that, and it's understandable, but I think it's really important to remember, as Gerardo said, that this is just an objective fact-finding exercise. It's a preliminary investigation. There's no finding at the end of that part of it. It's just tell us what happened, provide any sort of information or evidence you've got, whatever that looks like, to help us.
Yeah, and the important thing around that is when the board does have to notify a vet that there's a complaint and they need to gather the information, the quicker you can get all the information, and the information that they require is set out when they send you the letter, the better it is in terms of the time frame for resolution of that complaint. The thing is that it is a process, and we have to make sure that we go through the process, so we can't just finalise it within one day. And I know that the longer it takes, the more pressure on the vets, because they're dwelling on it, they're churning around, what's happening with my complaint. Mm-hmm. We do keep people informed of where it's at, and obviously the process is that the client has a right of reply as well once the information comes through, and then it goes back to the vet who has to reply again. So that process, the quicker the information comes back to us, the quicker the complaint can be resolved. But it was really interesting because the number of complaints versus the number of registered vets in New South Wales, you have a 1 in 25 chance of actually getting a complaint. Does that mean
unless you're Hubert and you're like
I had to get that stat for you guys, because what it means is that it isn't unlikely that you will get one. So you are amongst peers, as in even the most amazing vets will get complaints, and it's not a reflection of you personally. In most cases, it's like we're talking about before, and when things go wrong, it's usually because the client, there's lots of reasons. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more complaints come through where there's a lot more money involved, where there's a lot of grief involved and a lot of client expectations that haven't been met. And of course, where we haven't developed that trust. And I think, Gerardo, in your line of work in emergency, you have most likely never met these clients before. So your ability to have that ongoing trust, you have to develop that trust there and then. And what we're finding is, I don't know about you, Kate, within our boards, a lot more complaints through emergency hospitals as well, where the fees are higher because of obviously the critical nature of the cases and the complexities of that, but also the fact that there's no general practice veterinarian client bond that's been developed over years. You have to develop that trust very quickly. And I can see how grieving, lots of money involved, critical case, never developed a relationship of trust with that vet. You can see how complaints can arise.
Ours probably isn't. I don't think there's a clear sort of increase necessarily in the emergency stuff in Victoria, but there certainly is a high percentage of the complaints that we see that involve more than one vet practice. And that's not necessarily to say that there's been anyone throwing anybody under the bus, but it just highlights that when you get different perspectives or different levels of trust or different language used even, owners hear different things, and they take that and layer it on what they're feeling and what their suspicions or fears or uncertainties are. And confirmation bias tells us that they hear something and go, that, and hold on to that and then shape it into a whole nother concern that ends up giving rise to a complaint against the first vet. And so we certainly see that pattern, and I guess open communication and self-awareness as well when you manage cases like that is incredibly important for vets.
Yeah, and over the years, I think having employed a lot of new graduates and seen a lot of students, the first thing I would always say to them is, remember, every other vet in every other practice is your colleague. They're not your competitor. They're your colleague. You might be working for them. They might be working for you in the future. And remember that when you are the second opinion vet, or the vet that sees a case 2 days later, you've got the benefit of progression of disease. And because of that, and because the client might now find themselves in a situation where, that the period of time that's gone by and the progression of the disease has resulted in a more critical case, they're probably going to say yes to the diagnostics and the treatment that the second vet is going to offer them.
Yep.
And they may have declined that with the first vet. So just be mindful that the first vet has probably made those recommendations or recommended those treatment options or diagnostics, which at the time when the animal wasn't critical may have been declined. So pick up the phone, call that vet, say, look, I've got your client. This is what I'm seeing now, just letting you know it's here with us. It's just that professional courtesy. And you may find out more about that case that might help lend itself to resolution of that animal's signs and illness in a timely manner, like not having to run a test because it's been done, all those sorts of things. We just got to be mindful that the person that saw the case 2 days ago, it may have presented very differently, and it may have actually progressed to a point now where it's very obvious. And I'll always remember, and this is something that happened to me as a new grad, had a large breed dog where it wasn't obvious that the dog had a foreign body in the stomach. X-rays back then weren't the quality that they are now, didn't have an ultrasound machine. And when it progressed to a specialist centre a few days later, obviously it had progressed and you could feel the corn cob. Mm-hmm. You didn't even have to do an ultrasound.
Yep.
But I guess the nice thing about that, it remains in my mind, the specialist picked up the phone and he rang me and he said, Mags, I just want to let you know that the client's here. I've let them know that there was no way you could have possibly felt that or seen that on the x-ray that you took. And, the dog's fine now, the surgery's been done. And when he put down the phone, I remember thinking to myself, I'm so glad I heard that, because that's how I'm going to treat every case from now on and every other vet that I'm a second opinion vet on. But it sticks in my mind about that kind of collegiality within our profession, and also making sure we do the right thing by the pet and the owner.
I just want to highlight here that corn cobs are the ultimate pain in the ass of foreign bodies.
I blame KFC for those little corn cobettes that they introduced.
Whatever they are, they just seem to fit very nicely. They get to the pylorus and then all of a sudden they just stop.
Yeah,
you can't see them, those little bastards on X-ray. Yeah, until days later, and then you're
that's
like,
right.
So obvious.
Yeah.
Mags, you mentioned an increase in case and complaints, and we talk about lots of complaints from emergency clinics. I'm curious, is there a standout type of complaint that you guys deal with mostly? Like what are some of the most common complaints that you get?
Yeah, Kate, you want to go first?
Well, I think we've certainly alluded to the number one, which is communication. Absolutely, always number one. And that can play out from things like a poor understanding of the benefits and costs, or the instructions, or the alternative options, which then feeds into unexpected outcomes, or alternatively poor owner compliance that then leads to poor outcomes. So insufficient clarity of consent is a really big one, because we're not just looking for a signature on a piece of paper. It really has to be informed consent. So they need to understand everything that sits behind what they're agreeing to, and that stems from communication. So the written communication, the written consent is only one piece of a much bigger communication picture that has to happen. As we've just talked about, the communications between practitioners that sometimes can actually hamper the best treatment for the animal, because they just didn't know what went on or who's responsible for it is another part. And then, as we've talked about before, that challenge in having constructive conversations after things don't go well, that then leave people like they don't understand, or that things have been hidden from them. People don't want to feel, understandably, like things have been hidden from them. So I guess from that point of view, that's probably number one. And there's lots that we've talked about. I guess the things that we can do to stop that, obviously prevention's obviously best with that one. So building your own and other skills around communication. Now in our Victorian guidelines, which have just been revised in the last 12 months after lots of input, we've actually, in the context of our CPD one, even though it's a national standard for how much CPD you have to do, there is actually now, we call out that there's a lot of non-clinical stuff that it really contributes to the professional standard of your work. And so we'd really encourage people to take up on things like communication skills, having hard conversations, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, all of the stuff that is going to help you in your professional life to uphold those standards and build those relationships. But it also helps outside your work life, which obviously, if we're talking about people thriving, we're not just vets working at work. It's about the bigger picture and how everything's going across the board. So there's heaps of value in that stuff. As Mag said before, manage your expectations openly and continuously. No one ever complains to us about too much communication. So we often get things where, they've got consent for a dental at the start, but then there isn't another phone call to say, right, we actually, now that we can see, we need 12 teeth out. And that has to happen. So we get a lot of complaints like that. So keeping that evolving as the case does is important. If things do go wrong, being really open about it and acknowledging the distress that things have caused, that first and foremost. It's not the same as saying I did something wrong. You might have, and that might need acknowledging too, but it's often about just acknowledging that. And I guess the other thing I'd say is being conscious of how you bring yourself to those situations, is that people can get quite defensive or even aggressive sometimes, the vets, in terms of how they respond to this sort of situation, because that's understandable. They're just as upset as the owner, and they're going to be their own harshest critic. But to maybe park that for a moment, be aware of it, park it, go into the conversation, listening attentively, but then go and seek support for that for yourself afterwards is really important.
Yeah, I think managing client expectations, that's a big one. And I think having worked this profession for a long time, I think what we probably find hard to do is to tell people bad news, or at least give people the understanding that things may not progress well and the animal may have a poor prognosis or even die. And I think offering euthanasia in those cases is really difficult for some vets, because we're trained to actually make everything better and fix things. And sometimes if those conversations are had, some people just want to be reassured that they can make that decision. And by having a vet say to them, at any point in time, if the animal's deteriorating, please let us know, because euthanasia is an option. And sometimes when people hear that at the start and they make that decision down the track when the animal's not progressing well, then they feel that you've backed them in that decision. Whereas I think sometimes complaints happen because there's going to be a poor outcome. They've spent a lot of money. The animal's died. No one's given that option at any point in time.
Gotcha.
And then I've seen a lot of complaints where if I knew it was going to be a bad prognosis or die, I would have euthanized it from the start, but I was never offered that option. I see that a lot, especially in critical care. Gerardo, I see you nodding there. But maybe that's an area where we as vets need to look at that and say euthanasia is a good death, and in some cases is warranted in those critical guarded prognosis cases where the client may not have the funds and may elect to euthanize prior to incurring a lot of funds, because that's where I think their expectation is if they're paying for something, the animal's going to live. And so we just got to manage that really well.
I think that expectations there are super important, but it's not just expectations that are set by us as veterinarians. Sometimes our staff set the expectations, hey, you got him down now, we're going to take care of him and they're going to be okay. The vets here now are here, like this super amazing veterinarian, Hubert, is then going to save your pet's life. And then Hubert's like, I can't save this, there is this cancer everywhere in his brain, chest and everywhere. Sometimes the expectation is somehow unfairly set by the team, but I also get, Mags, what you said there, that sometimes it's like you don't want to seed the idea that there is something more sinister here than something that's easy. So for me, if it's an old dog that comes down that's flat and lethargic, it's like, hey, it could be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but hey, look, it could be something like cancer,
I'm a bit guilty of that, or I historically have been. And I think it just comes from that, and again, we've talked about it so much, Gerardo, the personality types in vet, the amiable personality. I don't like to worry people. It sounds so stupid, but I don't want them to go home and worry about their dogs. So I'll downplay stuff. Or I used to. Now I'm aware of it, so I try not to. Exactly what you say. I try to be a little bit more negative about it. And then if you win, then fantastic, then you're the hero.
You're not alone. You're not alone, Hubert. We've certainly had them like that. They had complaints like that where people have said, I just don't want to make people feel bad if they don't have to.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I guess it's about the awareness of where that can lead. And I guess from a consumer point of view, obviously looking at human health outcomes and processes I've been through, I want to know the whole range. I want to know what my chance of death is. I want it. So I think affording that to clients is really important. So,
and I think to Kate's point as well, that no one ever complains about too much communication. If you do find that you've admitted the animal and things have progressed to a point where you've got more information, you're like, okay, I now have to change my prognosis. I think those sorts of things, that constant communication with the client about where things are at, that's really important, especially in those cases where it can change very quickly and once you get more information. So communication, obviously meeting client expectations. To me, informed consent is not just a consent form where clients sign. They have to know what's happening, the implication, the treatment that you're offering or the diagnostics, and the implications of not doing something. That's even more important, because if someone declines something, you should actually let them know, by doing this, we won't have this information. So we're making decisions based on very limited information. And I think we as vets have been doing that for many, many years. We make decisions every day and we make them with as little information sometimes. And the expectation of the client is that we have all the answers, but the information that we have isn't complete. And we do that every day as vets. And we just got to let clients know that if we don't have that information, we're making decisions based on limited. So them declining a treatment, we have to just let people know what that means. And that's part of the informed consent process. And of course, managing expectations from the start. You need to be realistic. And the other thing that I think is important, apart from making sure you've got great clinical notes, what I've been finding with the shortage of vets is we do have a lot more vets looking after certain cases, because you might have more locums coming in, and that becomes even more important to either have handover rounds or really good plans and communication notes on your medical notes, because of the number of vets that may be treating a case. And what I found is where there's more vets treating a case, the more likelihood that there is going to be a breakdown in communication. So just being mindful of having really good plans and handovers of cases. And the other thing, I think, don't be pushed to treat by a client if it doesn't fall within your skill set or you have concerns, because I find that twofold. From a clinical perspective, that's really hard to justify internally, but also from an animal welfare perspective, there are things that clients may ask you to do where you feel like, no, actually that's not in the best interest of the animal. I think you need to call it out. And I also think you can decline to do things based on those things. And I think when things go wrong, it's because you may have actually performed something that you weren't comfortable with. So that's where I think your peer support team is important, and referring internally or to another vet clinic is important. And obviously, as Kate said, encouraging CPD within the clinic, both from a clinical perspective and from a communication perspective. That is really where I think vets and vet clinics need to go, because we know that we can only progress people so much within clinical skills and education. But I think from an EQ perspective, there is so much more to gain by having effective communication, running your consults in a way that actually is structured so that the clients walk away with clear expectations. And then the other thing, of course, is how you make people feel, because it's that whole client experience. If they walk away going, I feel really relieved that vet is looking after my pet, that's what you want to get to.
So, yeah, in terms of just going back to the three kinds, we've talked about the communication. Mags just touched on clinical records, which obviously Gerardo sounds like he's poster boy for. Doing good ones now.
I know, but I have something to say about this later. Just wait, you guys.
Oh, okay, it's coming back. I guess when Mags talks about having really good clinical notes, something that we don't always see in there is that it's not just the facts and findings that need to be recorded. It's also the reasons behind why things did or didn't happen. Record that stuff. So you've got some proof a year down the track, if you need it, of help us as boards to understand, how did things unfold? Why did you go that way? Because we're coming from those kind of perspectives. We get it. So write down those reasonings and the communications that actually have happened, because as well as managing the case well, as Mag said, it's also, we all read each other's histories. So I think it's a really valuable learning experience too. If you've actually set a really nice thought process out, then people learn from that. So that's really valuable. And then the third most common complaint is around clinical management, but that comes after those other two, which is perhaps reassuring to know. And I guess the message I'd have there around that is that we know on the boards that there's no one way of doing things as a vet. Even the 6 vets sitting on the board would probably do something all slightly different themselves. So that's why really what we're looking for is that logical, informed kind of progression of thoughts and decisions that's based on a contemporary knowledge and the guidelines. That's a really good start. It's not about, was that the right thing to do? Was it one that made sense? Because what we're looking at is your professional judgment.
Yeah, and that Kate's point around, why you thought that way and your progression of what you did and your logical sequence of events is really important, because as a board, when we get the complaint, we already have the answer. We've seen the whole thing.
Yeah, of course.
But when you're making those decisions as a clinician, that first consult, you're making decisions based on your physical exam and your history from the client. Whereas as a board, we've seen the whole complaint from start to finish, and we know what the end result is. Yeah. So if you can show why your reasoning behind everything you did at that point in time, it does make it easier. But I will just say one thing about medical notes. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Gerardo. You can write too much as well.
I'd love hearing that.
The reason I say that is because if there's just so much information that there's no logical sequence to what you're writing, and you're just writing, and then there's no actually set plan or no written communication as to what the client said or didn't say and what they consented to, someone is not going to read it. Mm-hmm. And that in itself lends itself to poor patient outcomes as well. And there was a really good study in Human Health and I think I talked about this with you, Kate, the other day, that actually people with chronic diseases, if they doctor shop amongst a number of GPs, there's actually a worse outcome to their chronic disease process because there's not that continuity of care. Yep. And so therefore, I think it's important that whilst histories need to be written in a way that encompasses everything from clinical and reasoning and client communication, it also needs to be written in a way that somebody can actually read it and actually take in everything without having to read an essay.
Okay, so this is what I was going to come back to, but Mag, so it's true. So us as emergency veterinarians, within the practice that I work in, we might consult for 6 hours, surgerize, prescribe, and work things up for another 6 hours. But then the next potentially 6 hours is writing history and notes, right? And it's getting to the crux of what is really required, what's required, to the point where we're like, actually, you know what? We're going to hire virtual assistants and then allow our vets, because we just did a podcast of the day with the head guru of burnout in Australia, Gordon Parker. And he goes, in the medical profession, the thing that, like, one of the things that contributes to medical professionals burning out is the writing of medical notes. And so for us, it's like the things that have saved us in the past from vet surgeon boards inquiries, or should we say inquisitions? As
investigations.
Oh, investigations. Okay, no, I didn't mean to say inquisitions. Okay, yes.
Crucifixions.
I'm just poking the bear. Okay.
You did.
I did totally poke the bear there. The things that have saved us was the fact that we had complete records. But complete records, like for us to write complete records is 6 hours. Yeah. So what I don't know.
What cost? Yeah.
At what cost?
Yeah. So define it for us. What constitutes that? I'll put it in a more practical question. The thing about you have to literally write down everything. So let's say my animal comes in for a very obvious problem. Do I have to write down their ears are fine, check the throat, rectal exam, normal, no neurological exams on it? I'm like, well, it came in for a cut on its, you know what I mean? Is that what are the guidelines there?
There are guidelines, and I guess and each state has them slightly differently. So it's very hard to say you must do this and this and this. But I guess the general sort of vibe would be that if you looked at it and you made some sort of observation about it, pop it in there. You might be there looking at a dog through its ears because that's what the owners told you at the time. Yep. And you might notice that it's limping a little bit, but they said, oh, don't worry about that. I really want its ears fixed. Yep. But a week later, something is going on with that leg, and they say that vet didn't even look at it. They missed it, and that's unprofessional. If you've written down, noticed a limp, owner, said, don't worry about it, that's relevant. So it's not relevant to the problem it's been presented for, but if you saw it or measured it or observed it or heard it, it's good to put it in there because you don't know how it's going to become relevant in the future. It's easy to 20/20 vision. Yeah. But I guess there probably is, on a personal non-board level. I think there probably is a trend, and I read about this not that long ago, that we are probably going to go down the path in the future just through lack of time and lack of vets and increased demand. And that piece that we know that meaningful work is absolutely core to engagement and motivation. And I saw someone said recently, I was saying, look, if you increase, and this is not on the board, wearing the board hat, but if you're improving your vet processes, like using virtual assistants, voice to text technology, getting different people to do different work, that sort of thing, you've got increased IT that supports all of those sort of thorough findings, then that increase in processes increases your meaningful work, because you're spending the time doing what you actually trained to do, which is problem solve and fix. So I think that's definitely a really important thing to know, that meaningful work has to be core to how you do your job well.
And one of the other things I think about making sure that you have the right systems and processes is having the right support around you. So if you have veterinary nurses that are cleaning cages and walking dog all day and holding up veins, you're not actually making the best of the support staff. And with the shortage of vets, we really need vets to be doing what the legislation requires only vets to do, which in New South Wales is to diagnose, prescribe and do surgery. And so therefore, we really need to make sure that we upskill our nursing staff so that they can assist our vets. And then if there are things like nurses that are doing the majority of their work as things that an animal attendant can do, then actually putting animal attendants in some of those roles to upskill, to allow our nurses to do more with our vets. And then obviously maybe increasing our customer service team if you've got too much paperwork to do, that you actually have people that are taking that off vets, because there's nothing worse than vets feeling like there's 10 people in the waiting room and you've got clients to see, but you're still admitting an animal in and writing all the paperwork. I think gone are those days. Now with the shortage of vets, we have to just think differently and smarter about how we utilise our expertise in ways that are actually meaningful, Kate, but also effective.
And it's a natural sort of thing that when you're in that position, of course you're going to resent the board for putting this guideline in place that you need to write this ridiculously long history. But actually, it's not just, the board is there for a purpose. There also needs to be the business management that supports it as well.
Yeah. Can I quickly go back to something you guys both mentioned a while ago? The clarity of consent, and you both said just a consent form is not enough. So what does clarity of consent look like? So in my head to go, well, yeah, we've written it down, you've signed at the bottom that you've agreed to treatment. How's that not enough? What more should we be doing?
I guess it plays out when they turn around and say, but I didn't know that if I did that, I signed. Yeah, that's my signature, but I didn't know that I could have blah, blah, blah. So I guess it does mean, first and foremost, knowing what the options are, the benefits and the risks. And again, that's stuff that you can record in your history and say that you've discussed those specific things. And then depending on what your form looks like, things may or may not be on there. Costs obviously are part of it. There's in Victoria now, we have 2 levels of consent in our guidelines. So we have and that's specifically done to reflect human medicine. So as I said, we're trying to be more congruent with the world in general rather than just living in our little vet bubble. And so informed consent means understanding risks, benefits, alternative options in terms of what actually happens to the animal. Informed financial consent is the second piece, and often they'll be on the same piece of paper, but that's about, yes, I actually give consent for that amount of money to be spent on that outcome. Okay. So there's 2 levels of consent, and I think if it doesn't all have to be recorded on that piece of paper, and sometimes consent under our guidelines doesn't have to be in writing. Obviously, it's easier to prove. But obviously, if you're standing on a farm and saying, look, grain overload, this is our chances. Do you want me to do it or not? Chances of survival this, chances of costing this, ongoing care is going to be this, yes or no. You're not going to write it on a piece of paper necessarily there and then, but you've gone through all that same motion to say, yep, it's really about making sure that every step you're treating owners, it's not an us and them. We are a team. Mm-hmm. And just as you would talk to your team, whether you're a doubles tennis player and saying, right, you go forward, I'll go back, or, I'm going to do this serve. It's the same with owners. You need to actually communicate about what you're doing so that to a point that, and you do everything in your power to make sure they understand. So whether that means you might have to get an interpreter to help, or get another person to come in, or use handouts or diagrams or YouTube videos, or any stuff that you like, podcasts, there you go, to help support anything you can do to build understanding. Gotcha. Because, and it will repay you even, because what you're trying to do is never get to the board stage.
Yeah, of course.
So that's the hard bit, is we don't always get feedback on the good stuff we're doing.
Yeah,
we only
gotcha.
get the bad feedback, which is bad, as in the stress of being.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, I think you're right, Kate. Like, that informed consent is around the client's not just signing a form, but actually understanding the implications of the treatment that's been offered or the treatment that's been denied. Things like, offering referral and then actually mentioning why the client declined referral. It's not about money. Maybe it's actually about the fact that they can't travel. But then it becomes something that has been explained to the client. And again, like I said before, it's about the implications of not doing a procedure or not doing a diagnostic, running a blood test or doing an X-ray prior to doing the surgery. But again, it's something that I think one of the things we need to also do is talk to the clients and seek clarification from them that they understood, get them to play back what you said to them. So do you understand what I've said? Do you understand what's going to happen to your dog and the things that, we're going to do today? But also that's where that whole making sure that you've got a really structured way that you run your consults, and I ask open questions at the start, obviously, to make sure that you've got all the information, and then seek clarification from the client that they understood what you're going to say. I still recall years ago someone telling me when I first started that a client misunderstood what putting to sleep was and thought that the animal was going to be anaesthetized instead of euthanized. So it's just the language you use, but making sure you seek clarification from the client that they understood. And that's why I think just standing by a signed consent form is not enough. It's about the risks, the implications. Really, it's risk mitigation. And at the end of the day, the board is there to assist you in that. The AVA is there. They've got fantastic information on their website about some guidelines you can follow, webinars, podcasts. So has the vet board. The vet board has some information for you. And one of the great things about the board, and even before I joined the board, is I used to ring them all the time and seek clarification, not only on things like consent forms and things like that, but it was always about, this is what's happened. This is a scenario that I am facing at the moment. And they would guide you, whether it's to a specific legislation or to someone from the Department of Local Government or whatever. So the board is there to help you. Pick up the phone and call them. We're not scary, or the people that work at the board aren't scary. And what they're trying to do is assist vets to hopefully be able to work in a way that allows them to enjoy their work and not have, obviously, a complaint filed against them.
I would say, just following on from that, I think people do find sometimes it's fantastic how many people vets actually do ring the board, that they're obviously trying to do the right thing and trying to be really proactive. I think there might be, sometimes a level of frustration that the vet board staff actually can't give specific advice. So you can't ring up and say, okay, I've got this consent form and is this okay?
Yeah,
we can't give that advice, even though you think, well, isn't that, you're the people who regulate it, you make a judgment on it. Yeah. We can't give that advice because that's the thing. We have to be impartial when a case that uses that consent form comes up in front of us. If we've given advice to say, yep, that's great, then we're not impartial anymore. So what we can do, as Mag said, is what they do is do direct them to, and that's why we have guidelines that are really quite explicit about what you need to consider. But how you actually enact that's one of the privileges of being a professional, is that you get to exercise your professional judgment. There's not one right way, but we do direct you to resources that can help support that. The only other thing I would say is that the AVA guidelines can be fantastic as a resource, but it's important to remember that they're not the guidelines that states regulate against. Okay. So they're recommendations, they're guidance to, and again, you can say, look, this is what a demonstration of peer expectations, but they're not the measure that we regulate by. So I think it's just important to remember that when you're looking at where your guidance comes from.
So just on that, those guidelines, again, often people feel like if you had to follow the guidelines to the letter, it'll be quite onerous and not always that practical. Are those guidelines that do this or else you're going to be in shit when things go wrong? Or is it, look, that's what you should strive for, but it's not necessarily, if you don't meet those, you're falling short, or you're going to be in trouble?
Absolutely. I think I'll jump in here just because we've just finished doing this. So we've just been immersed in guideline think and how we actually put this together to reflect that over the last couple of years. At the end of the day, the yardstick is exercise your professional judgment. That's what all of that is about. And what the guidelines are there to do is to help you understand what that might look like and the kinds of considerations that you need to think about. So it's kind of a prompt. It's certainly not a rule book. Ours have actually moved right away from the old prescriptive type of, there used to be one in there about how to do a cesarean. It was incredibly, specific and prescriptive, and that's not what we're about. What we're about with the guidelines is empowering people to be able to layer all those different factors. And I think we all understand that it's very easy to say you must put the welfare of the animal at the centre of all you do, which is absolutely what it's all about. But we had a lot of discussion and debate about how do you word that in a way that reflects then that you also need to prioritise human safety. So you can't say, well, that animal needs that, but I'm going to get my vet and my nurse are going to get completely mauled by trying to do that. That's okay to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. So there is a real working of all the different layers of things. And it's not just our legislation that you're trying to follow. It's also a whole range of other things. As I said, medicine, poisons, animal welfare acts, fair work. It's quite difficult to navigate. We've tried to put in ours references and cross-references so that it's easier to see where things link and where you can find other advice that you might have to consider. And I guess sitting over all of that, ours now have professional behaviours, really are the sort of key things that underpin it all. That, okay, if you're in this situation and you're going, well, here are all the guidelines around these things, I'm trying to balance all of that, taking it back to, okay, the behaviours that would reflect professionalism in this situation, which are also outlined there. Mm-hmm. And they're quite straightforward, things like respect, integrity, all of those sorts of things. Then bringing that into any scenario is really what we're talking about, is that there's no one right way or wrong. You don't live or die by following a guideline.
All right, brilliant.
Yeah, and as Kate said, there are so many different legislations that we as veterinarians work under, and some of them, you need lawyers to go through and explain them to you. And some of them we face every day, the local government acts and how to deal with stray animals and things like that. We operate under so many different legislations. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act is another one. And the most important thing is that everything we do, we should be looking at that code of conduct as veterinarians and making sure that we abide by that. And I think it's really important that our behaviours, we are a profession. We're not an industry. We're a profession within it. Industry, but we are professionals, and as professionals there is a code that we should be held to account for because we are professionals.
Oh, that's such a tricky thing, right? Because I remember once posting something on social media about us as an industry, and then someone texted me replied, I believe that we are profession. And it just blew my mind. And ever since then I'm like, yes, we are profession, we are professional. What is it, what are the actions of a professional is, as opposed to, I'm just a vet nurse, right?
Yeah.
So Mags, you just hit a trigger point.
Well, I think we are professionals working within a large industry. There's so many other industries within the pet and animal, pets and animals, like there's massive industries around us. But as a profession, we're legislated, whereas a lot of other parts of this industry aren't. They can't really be held to account because they're not a professional who has a professional body that's actually able to investigate them.
The question I have is punishment. Okay, because I thought that me and my interaction with the board was like, that's it, I'm gone. My board, my license is gone, and all of a sudden now I will have to work as a librarian. I was a librarian before I became a veterinarian. But what is the level of punishment? Because my understanding is that if something just happens, it's not that you could just let things happen accidentally. But if there is an actual purposeful misconduct or something, then that is an issue.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that. I thought that I had to defend my reputation as a veterinarian and all those kind of things when I was taking the board. And I got there, we talked about it, and then the level of punishment, I was like, yeah, hey, I get that. That was reasonable. So what levels of punishment are there?
I guess it comes down to, again, we're talking about risk management, so risk prevention if we can. So we're looking at the seriousness of what's gone on. And in Victoria, we actually as a board have been quite explicit in our guidelines webinars about a single mistake in and of itself isn't necessarily unprofessional conduct. So that aside, we are looking at risk of whatever went on. So there's kind of two levels, and I think New South Wales is the same here in terms of so what happens is they go through that preliminary investigation process that we talked about before. And then of those, some of them don't progress further beyond that because we look at it and say, okay, that actually, now we know what happened. It doesn't look like we've come near unprofessional conduct there. That's gone. And at that stage, it's about 2/3 of them that go through that whole investigation process that don't actually get progressed into a hearing. So that's the first thing. Just because you've been notified of a complaint against you doesn't mean that it's actually 2/3 of the time you won't necessarily progress to hearing. But when it does go to hearing, you've got one of two levels of hearing, and we're talking here about professional conduct. We've also got complaints about fitness to practice, and that's a different story altogether. That's really based on health and substance dependency. So that's and only 2% of our complaints investigations in the last couple of years were actually fitness to practice. So we're just talking about professional conduct here. Yeah. There's the informal hearing or a formal hearing. And the reason I'm giving you all of this is because that is the bit that's critical to going, what are the punishments? And they're not punishments all the time. Some of them, as you say, are quite constructive. So at informal hearing level, and this may vary a little bit between states, but in Victoria, the most common things, absolutely hands down, the most common things that they're called determinations after a finding of unprofessional conduct at an informal hearing, which by definition is conduct that's potentially unprofessional conduct, not of a serious nature, is the language under the Act. So they're things like what we've been talking about often there. And again, it's all about risk. How much risk does this pose in terms of severity or likelihood? So that's how we determine which basket it goes into in terms of for the hearings, and that then determines what are the determinations going to be. So at informal hearing, we're looking at the most common things are continuing education and counselling. So counselling doesn't sound like you have to go and see a professional. It's us giving you feedback at the end of an informal hearing, which is, as you said, Gerardo, it's much more like just a conversation. You know, you've got a clear set of what we're looking at in terms of allegations, and it sounds really formal and scary like that. That's just the legal speak we have to use. But basically, there's really key points that we as a board want to understand and are looking at in terms of, is this under professional or not? So you know what you're answering and responding to. And then we then provide counselling in terms of, this is where, as you said, Gerardo, this is where you went wrong. These are the other options you might want to have considered that might have led to a different outcome. So it's more explanation and future things to think about. Second thing is continuing education, and that's the other really, really common outcome. And that can look anything like, it can be formal, it can be mentoring, it can be submitting clinical records for us to review and give feedback on so that you get them better. I want to put in place those measures to make sure that we don't just say, go and do this, and we have no understanding as a board of whether that risk's actually been effectively resolved or not. The other two outcomes there that probably carry more potential scariness in your head, and they're the more, I guess, the deterrent side of the outcomes, is the caution and the reprimand. So they're your four outcomes that you can get from an informal hearing. And about, just to give you an idea of the odds of that set of outcomes, about 1 in 5 of Victorian complaints lodged over the last couple of years ended up in an informal hearing, and about 2/3 of those found that unprofessional conduct had occurred. And as I said, most went to continuing education counselling, a couple with reprimand and caution. Mm-hmm. Other end, the big scary end is and that's just perception, but it is when we're looking at the more risky behaviours and the more serious professional conduct. So that's a formal hearing. That's when there is legal representation usually occurs, and it's allowed, and the complainant can be there. It can be most often open to the public. So it's a more formal, we've got a court reporter and everything there. So for us, it happens on the board premises. It's not in a courtroom or anything, but it is still a more formal proceeding. And the same 4 outcomes are possible there. But then you've also got another range, and that's with your conditions, limitations or restrictions to practice. And that can include things like not working with access to S8s, for example, or something like that. So those things are designed to, again, prevent risk, not just to the animals, but also to how you practice, so that you're doing the best you can. Fines, legal costs of the hearings, altering or cancelling a specialist endorsement, or suspending or cancelling the registration. Now, again, just to give you some sort of perspective with that, there were about 1 in 14 of our complaints lodged actually ended up at a formal hearing a couple of years ago. So it's not a high number. And of the findings at those formal hearings in, I think it was 2019-20, there were 4 formal hearings held. Of those, all 4 were asked to pay legal costs, received a reprimand, and had to do continuing education. Only one of those had their registration suspended for a period, and it's not a long period. In that case, I think it was 6 months. And one had their ability to re-register. They weren't allowed to do that for a period of 6 months, I think, so delayed. So it's I think 3% of complaints lodged actually end up having one of those 2 things, suspension or cancellation. So it's a really low risk.
Yeah.
So in New South Wales, we have a subcommittee of the board that is the complaints committee, and there are 2 vets and 1 consumer member, and there are others on that if required. We collect all the information and everything else and get the information back from the vet. They get to respond, the client gets to respond. We as a board, we don't technically have those hearings before the board, Kate, like in Victoria, but we do have the power to summons a person to appear before the board to provide more evidence. And then that committee makes a recommendation to the board, but the board has to determine the outcome of the complaint. But once a decision is made, 70% of our complaints are actually dismissed. And most of the complaints, up to 70% of complaints, are actually when the patient is a dog, and 17% of cats and 9% of horses. And the reason I say that is because it's really interesting. You know, that's obviously the majority of vets practice in major cities with small animals, and that reflects also the number of complaints. So when you think about it, we've had more complaints over the last year, but we've also as well had more dismissal of complaints. So those complaints that end up with unsatisfactory professional conduct or professional misconduct, we, as Kate said, there's a reprimand or a caution for the vet. We can impose fines. We can require the vet pay some costs. We can impose conditions on their registration, and we can also ask them to undertake further education. And really, it's around trying to reduce risk into the future. There are, at times, we have the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. We can actually ask the tribunal to take that on for a finding after the board's made a recommendation. And the NCAT can also be asked by the veterinarian who the complaint's been made against to review the finding made by the board. So obviously, most of our complaints are around conduct, but there are also health complaints, as Kate said. So that's our process. But the most important thing is that, you know, the likelihood you get a complaint, 1 in 25, 70% are dismissed. Yeah. And I guess with the others, if they are, you know, unsatisfactory professional conduct, there are recommendations made. There may be fines imposed or conditions placed on your registration. But as I said, the majority of them are dismissed.
That's great to hear. That's reassuring, because this is my opinion, and this is how this all started, because I'm of the opinion that people catastrophize a little bit. You know, this thing that we worried about that will fairly likely never actually happen, and when it happens, it's actually not as bad as we fear it will be. And I think if we can just flip that around and go, let's you know, it's not that the big scary boogeyman out to get us. It is as you guys say.
It's an opportunity for reflection, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like in terms of saying, okay, and that's something that I'd say that in terms of advice, in terms of managing your complaints and trying to flip that headspace around from being against the wall feeling to, okay, I recognize that I'm stressed and I've got all this energy going on. How can I channel that constructively? Is providing some sort of reflection and in your response back to the board, doing that, providing some sort of reflection on what's occurred. And if there are things that you've identified either together or on your own that could change, pop that in there, because that's stuff that we're looking at, because again, it comes down to risk. So if you've taken those steps, that's fantastic.
That's right.
So yeah, I guess it is just seeing it all as a really valuable exercise in seeing how we can be better.
I think one of the other things that we should all remember is that you can feel isolated when you get a complaint. And certainly in my time, not just on the board, but prior to that and within my own organisation that I play a role in now, having your peers help you, being able to talk to them about the complaint, being able to get some help around maybe drafting some of your responses back, it really does help. Don't feel like you're isolated. There are so many people that can help you. And one of the things that always helps when something goes wrong is, and I know this sounds funny, but if somebody else can say, oh, that happened to me, it actually does take that it's not just me, because you do feel like when you have a complaint that oh my God, something's wrong with me. Like I said, it's not a person. People do take it personally, but I think if we can share and help each other within your team with that complaint, it does take a lot of that load off that vet.
Yeah, coming back to your fear point and why we started this conversation in the first place, and the fact that we've talked about different ways of doing things and being quite aware of all the guidance and guidelines around there. And one of those is, as we've talked about, practicing within your capabilities and giving informed consent, which actually also means telling the client about what your capabilities are. But the key bit here, I guess, in terms of we're trying to encourage a growth mindset across the whole profession, really, because that's how we all get better. So recognizing the guidance to practice within your capabilities is one thing. We only get better by trying new stuff and taking on new challenges. So the boards really, I think people can sometimes, I know I've heard particularly graduates and things say, okay, but if I'm not good at this, I haven't done it before, I shouldn't be doing it. The thing is, it's seeking those appropriate support. So that's having your supervision and your mentor and making sure you've got informed consent, learning from them. Mistakes aren't unprofessional, they're human. Yeah. And actually, I guess, recognizing that that's a fantastic growth opportunity and learning from it is really what we're about.
Yeah, that's right. And I do see more people practicing defensively because they are scared. Mm-hmm. Hubert, I know you mentioned that, it's about being scared about a complaint. And that really does detriment your ability to grow, like Kate said, because one of the great things about being a vet when you graduate is you can do everything in terms of your ability to do surgery, anesthesia, all those sorts of things. But again, it's about developing those skill sets so you are confident. The only way you can be confident in something is to do it and to do it again and again. And I do believe that having the right mentorship and being able to be supported in your first few years so you have those learning opportunities means that you hopefully will be able to stay in the profession, which is what we're trying to achieve here, is that we don't lose really good people in the profession because they are scared of a board complaint.
Yeah. Excellent. I think that's super useful, and I hope that we achieve our goal of making people feel a bit more reassured and a little bit more happy and less scared.
The vet surgery board is not the Spanish Inquisition, and if you're too young to know what that means, it's like you're stood in front of 7 people with muskets, and no, I'm just kidding, you're making that up. Hubert's totally going to chop that out.
We'll chop most of your stuff out, like always. All right, guys.
Well, thank you very much for having us. Anyway, it's been great. Obviously, there's lots to talk about, and we're both quite passionate about making sure that people understand what boards are and what they aren't, and the mindsets behind it. So thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been brilliant.
It's been great. And thanks, Kate. It's been good to actually talk to you about all this stuff and the stuff that you're doing with the vet sustainability program as well, because I do think there's a link between all of this.
Yeah, for sure.
That's probably for another podcast.
All right, I promised you that I'll tell you more about sustainable vet careers. I'm a bit biased here, to be honest, because I've been helping Kate with putting together some of the marketing material for SVC. But the only reason I'm doing that is because I think that SVC is onto something really good. There are a lot of people and organizations working very hard at the moment to make the vet profession a better place for those who work in it, which is very exciting. But do you ever feel a bit overwhelmed? Like, okay, so which resources should I use and who's going to pay for it? Which is where SVC comes in. SVC is not offering content or courses or training or anything like that. Instead, SVC aims to do research into what is needed, what will be the most effective changes we can implement, and what the proven best resources are. Then they'll put them all in one place so you don't have to spend days scouring the net, and then do more research to measure the impact and adjust what's on offer based on the best data. But here's the best part. I once heard this quote: "A dream without a plan is just a wish." SVC has a dream, but they also have a plan. The core difference with SVC is a unique funding model where vet customers will pay a small levy on drug purchases, which will be collected by the drug distributors and then managed by SVC to help those in the profession pay for the resources we mentioned before, which, as I'm sure you know, can be a huge stumbling block for many people in the profession. Go and check them out at sustainableveterinarycareers.org to check out what they're up to. And while you're there, please do the survey. It's step 1 in the research that we need towards better.